So we should all know that the absolute value of 3 is 3, and the absolute value of negative 3 is also 3, because absolute value is the absolute distance from that value to 0. So to get a visual on that, we could draw a quick number line. We could put the value of negative 3 right here, negative 2, negative 1, 0, 1, 2, 3. So when I say what's the absolute value of negative 3, it's the distance from here to 0. That's 1, 2, 3. So that's why the answer, the absolute value of negative 3 is 3. And likewise, the absolute value of positive 3, the distance is also 1, 2, 3. So that's why the absolute value of 3 is also 3. Key word is distance, because distance is always going to be positive, right? When you're talking about the distance, it doesn't matter if you're walking from here to Heber, you're walking 4 miles, or if you're walking from here to Heber backwards, you're still walking 4 miles. Anyhow, I hope we understand that. Let's take a look at something more basic, or not more basic. Let's look at the simplest type of equation there is that require absolute values, or that have absolute values. Let's go with the absolute value of x equals 3. Now, even before we answer this, how do we know when an answer is an answer? For example, x plus 2 equals 5. What's the answer to x plus 2 equals 5?
3.
It's 3. Now, why is the answer 3 right there? Because 3 plus 2 will give it a true statement, 5. It'll make it a true statement. So when we say find the answer, you're really thinking of the value that'll make it a true statement. And 3 is the only number that'll make it a true statement. 3 plus 2 equals 5. So if we look over here, what value will work in there for x? 3. Okay, so let's write that down. Right below, let's write down x equals, actually let me write it with more space. X equals 3. Is that the only answer that there is? No, there's also x equals negative 3. That's right. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is, for the first time, we're going to have equations that actually have two answers, the 3 and the negative 3. And the bottom line is, we have two situations when we have absolute values that we need to think of. This is the positive situation, and this is the negative situation. And I always like to separate them both with the squiggly line. Other teachers don't do this. I like to do this. So the question is, we need to have the rules on how to solve absolute value equations. And the rule is, you got to set up the positive situation and the negative situation. Now, could you guys explain to me the visual difference from the original to the positive situation? What's the visual difference that you see there? Right here you have the absolute values. Right here you don't have them, huh? And that is the instruction on how to write your positive situation. You write it exactly the way it is without the sticks, without the absolute values. Yay?
Yay.
The negative situation, what's the visual difference from here to the negative situation? There's no absolute values, just like the positive. There's no absolute value over here. There's no absolute value. But in addition to that, the right side got a negative right in front of it, right? So that's the instruction for setting up the negative situation. So guys, to go over the instructions here, the positive situation, write it exactly the way it is without the sticks. The negative situation, same thing, no sticks, but you also change the sign of the right side. Yay? Okay, so let's go to something more fun. And that would be the notes right here. We're all going to have to copy these down. And what does it say? It says, in order to solve an absolute value equation, we must set up both the positive situation and the negative situation. And before you copy this down, just read it with me. Make sure you understand it before you copy it. I always set up pos, neg, squiggly line, and here's the description on how to set up your positive situation. It says, for the positive situation, simply write the equation the way it is without the absolute values. For the negative situation, write it also without absolute values, but also change the sign of what's on the right side of the equal. Okay, so here's an example down here. It says the absolute value of 2x minus 1 equals 7. Okay, how am I going to set up the positive situation? I write it exactly the way it is without the absolute values. Notice there's nothing there. It's just 2x minus 1 equals 7. 2x minus 1 equals 7. No absolute values. Does that make sense? Okay? And for the negative situation, it's the same thing. No more absolute values. They're gone. It's just 2x minus 1. And I'm getting a phone call right in the middle of the recording. So, like I was saying, the negative situation, it's the same thing without the absolute values. There's no absolute values here. But we also changed the sign of the right side of the equal sign. So I had a 7. Now it's a negative 7. That's how you do the negative situation, right? And then, of course, you're going to solve this guy, and you're going to get 2 answers. But before we even go on to solving, let's actually copy this down. So I'm going to pause it. If you're doing this at home for the first time, hit pause and copy all these notes down into your notebook. And then we'll continue from there in a couple of seconds. Hit pause. So if you're at home, you should have just unpaused it after writing down everything. And now let's take a look at this first example. And once again, first of all, this part right here shouldn't be done yet. You're supposed to write pause, neg, squiggly line, and for the positive situation, you write it exactly the way it is without the absolute value sticks. So it's 2x minus 1 equals 7. There it is, 2x minus 1 equals 7. For the negative situation, it's the same thing. No sticks, no absolute values, but you change the 7 to a negative 7. That's the negative situation. And now what do? We solve both. So we're going to go plus 1, cancels. You're going to get 2x equals 8, and then you're going to divide by 2 on both sides. So the answer is x equals 4, yay? So that must mean that over here your answer is negative 4, right? Wrong. It's not negative. You can't just do that. You actually have to work it out and do it, right? So we're going to subtract or add 1 over here to get rid of the minus 1. Add 1 over here. You're going to end up with a new equation that says 2x equals negative 6. And then what do? Divide by 2, divide by 2. So we see that the answer ends up being x, negative 3. That's right, x is negative 3. And those are our 2 answers for this absolute value equation, okay? So it's pretty straightforward. If you follow your notes, you set up the positive situation just by rewriting it without the sticks, the negative situation by changing the sign on the right side. Now, in Algebra 2, we give more complicated absolute value equations. Sometimes you might start out with the 3 out here in the front. Then you would have to get rid of that 3 first before setting up the positive and negative situation, canceling it out. But what you do to one side, you'd have to do to the other. But that's in Algebra 2. In this homework assignment, we don't have anything outside the absolute values, so we don't need to really worry about that. Question? Anyway, let's do this. Let's push this to the side. Now let's just come up with one right here. Let's keep it basic. Everybody write this down in your notebooks. X, let's go with the minus 3 absolute value equals, give me a number. 14, I guess. Okay, why not? X minus 3 equals 14. If I asked you to solve it, what would you do? Hit pause and try to solve it, and then unpause and watch me work it. Okay, so you should have finished it by now, and we are again gonna set up the positive situation and the negative situation. Okay, squiggly line in the middle. How do you do the positive situation? Exactly the way it is, x minus 3 equals 14 without the absolute values. The negative situation is the same thing. X minus 3 equals, but instead of 14, we change it to a negative 14. And then we solve both. Okay, so we're going to go plus 3 here, plus 3 over here. Your answer will be x equals 17. Done. And then over here, plus 3 over here, plus 3 over here. You're going to get x equals negative 11. That's right. Those are your 2 answers. Question. That is an excellent question. The question again was, what if this was a negative 14? And you know what? Let's do that. Let's get this out of the way and let's change this. Let's make it look like a negative 14 right there, yeah? Now, check it out, guys. Some of us are going to get so pumped up about this that you're going to start setting up the positive situation and the negative situation. But here's the fact. Here's the truth. What is this? This is an absolute value, right? And if you ever have an absolute value of something, your answer has to be what? Has to be positive, right? So when you say the absolute value of this equals negative 14, you don't even have to do any work. You just simply say this. which means no solution. And let me repeat that again. If you have an absolute value all by itself, now if you had a number out here, like let's say we had a -2 out here in the front. Yeah, then you could actually work this out, because you would divide this side by 2, divide this side by -2, divide this side by -2, and that would become +7 on this side, and you could work it out because a +7 could be an answer. But let's say that wasn't there. Let's say it was just that absolute value equals -14. Right there, you're like, wait a minute, this can't happen. An absolute value cannot give you a negative number, so you would just say no solution on that one. Sounds great? Okay. No? So there's a second portion of today's notes. We've already reviewed how to solve absolute value equations. You set up the positive situation and the negative situation. But we're also going to have to work backwards. If they give you a number line and they tell you that your answers are -2 and 6, and they're going to want you to actually write the absolute value equation of this graph that has the answer -2 and has this answer 6. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing you have to do, here are the notes. The setup is this. It's going to be absolute value of x minus your midpoint. Now, what do I mean by midpoint? I'm talking about the point that's perfectly in the middle between -2 and +6. Okay? Now, there's different ways of finding the midpoint. One way is to actually visually count. I'm going to go 1 in, 1 in, 1 in, 1 in, 1 in, 1 in. This value right here is your midpoint, isn't it? Okay, so that would be, the midpoint would be right here, which is 2, right? Okay, so another way of doing it, instead of counting, is to say, okay, well, how far is it from 6 all the way to -2? How far is it? It would be saying, what's the difference between 6 and -2? And if you think about that, the difference between 6, the difference, and -2, what is that? That's 8. So if you know that from one side to another is 8, then how could you get to the middle? By going 4, half of 8. So think about that. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's your midpoint. Or 1, 2, 3, 4, that's your midpoint. So we know our midpoint's 2. Okay, once you find that midpoint, the setup is this. X minus the midpoint equals the distance from the point to the midpoint. So my equation will be x minus what? 2, close absolute value, equals, now what's the distance from the point to the midpoint? It's 4. So, and it doesn't matter if you say from 6 to 2, that's 4, or from -2 to +2, that's also 4, right? So the distance from a point to your midpoint is 4. And that's the setup. Now, let me prove it to you that that's a setup. If I were to solve this guy, what would I have to do? The positive and the negative. That's disgusting. The positive is x minus 2 equals 4. The negative is x minus 2 equals what? There you go. And on the positive, if you add 2 to both sides, you get x equals 6. And the other one, if you add 2 to both sides, you get x equals what? -2. Ladies and gentlemen, right there we proved that this equation is the right one, because the answers are 6 and -2. And if we go back up to the number line, there's 6, there's -2. So not only are we learning how to solve using positive and negative situations, we're also going to learn how to go backwards from the actual graph of the answers to the actual setup of the equation of the absolute value. I hope this helps you out. Check it out on Edmodo.